Some dogs carry toys. Some dogs carry supplies. But this old K-9 carried a secret that one Marine thought was buried forever. The snow had been falling for 3 straight days across the quiet mountains of Montana, covering the empty roads, the pine trees, and the small wooden cabin where Staff Sergeant Ethan Walker lived alone. At 42 years old, Ethan had learned how to live with silence. He had once spent his life surrounded by voices, commands, and the constant movement of military service. Now, his days were simple. A cup of black coffee in the morning, a walk around his property, the same old chair beside the window every evening. To most people, it looked peaceful, but Ethan knew the truth. Sometimes silence was not peace. Sometimes silence was just a place where old memories waited. On that freezing evening, when the temperature dropped below 20 degrees Fahrenheit, Ethan heard something unusual outside his cabin. Not a vehicle, not a person, a slow movement through the snow. He opened the door and saw a figure standing beneath the pale winter sky. An old German shepherd, gray around the muzzle, snow covering its fur. Its breathing calm but tired. Ethan froze for a moment because he recognized that face. "Shadow," he whispered. The dog looked at him with familiar eyes. Eyes that carried years of memories Ethan had tried not to revisit. Shadow was not just any German shepherd. He was a retired military K-9. Years earlier, he had worked beside Ethan and his closest friend, Marcus Reed. They had shared missions, long nights, and moments that created a bond words could never fully explain. But life had moved on. Ethan left the service. Marcus was no longer part of his daily world. And Shadow disappeared into another chapter of life. Or at least, that was what Ethan believed. Then he noticed something behind the old K-9. A heavy military ammo box sitting in the snow, covered in ice, marked with scratches from years of being carried and stored. Ethan stepped outside slowly. His eyes stayed on the box. He knew that kind of container. He knew the meaning behind it. "Where did you get this?" he asked quietly. Shadow simply stood there, watching him. The dog did not look lost. He did not look confused. He looked like he had completed a journey. Ethan walked closer and saw an old strap attached to the box. His heart became heavy with questions. Why would Shadow come here after all these years? Why would he bring something connected to his military past? And why now? He brought the box inside and placed it near the fireplace. The warmth filled the room, but Ethan still felt the cold mystery sitting in front of him. He ran his hand across the metal surface and noticed something carved into the side. A name. Marcus Reed. Ethan stepped back. For years, he had tried to move forward without looking behind him. But standing there with Shadow beside him, he realized something. Some memories do not disappear. They wait for the right moment to return. And on that quiet winter night in Montana, an old Marine, a loyal K-9, and a forgotten box were about to uncover a story that had been waiting for years to be told. The old ammo box sat quietly beside the fireplace, but to Ethan Walker, it felt louder than any sound he had heard in years. The cabin was warm, the fire was burning, and Shadow was resting on the wooden floor nearby. Yet Ethan could not take his eyes away from the metal container that had appeared out of the snow like a message from another lifetime. He had spent years convincing himself that the past was finished. But now the past was sitting only a few feet away. Ethan slowly reached for the old latch. His hand stopped for a moment. There were memories inside that box. Memories he was not sure he was ready to face. Shadow lifted his head and watched him. The old German shepherd did not move. He simply waited, as if he already knew that some things had to happen at the right moment. Ethan opened the box carefully. Inside were not military supplies or anything that belonged to a mission. Instead, there were items wrapped with care. A worn photograph, a small notebook, a folded letter sealed inside an envelope, and a tiny handmade bracelet that looked like it belonged to a child. Ethan picked up the photograph first. His breath became quiet. It was Marcus Reed standing beside Shadow years earlier. Both of them looked younger, happier. Behind them was a life Ethan remembered but had tried to leave behind. He turned the photograph over and saw a date written on the back. It was from the final year they had worked together. Ethan placed it down and picked up the letter. His fingers felt heavier than the paper itself. The handwriting was unmistakable. Marcus. The same handwriting Ethan had seen on countless notes during their years together. For a long moment, Ethan just stared. He wondered why Marcus had placed these things in the box. He wondered why Shadow had carried them across the snow and brought them to him. Finally, Ethan opened the letter. The first words immediately stopped him. "Ethan, if you are reading this, then Shadow found his way back to you." Ethan looked toward the dog. The room became completely silent. Marcus had known. Somehow, Marcus had believed that one day Shadow would return with this message. Ethan continued reading. The letter was not about regret or sadness. It was about trust. Marcus wrote about the friendship they shared, about the moments they experienced, and about someone Ethan had not thought about in years. A young girl named Emily Carter. Ethan lowered the letter slowly. That name meant something. He searched his memory. Emily was Marcus's daughter. The little girl who used to draw pictures whenever Marcus visited home. The child who once gave Shadow a small bracelet and told the dog to keep it safe. Ethan looked back at the bracelet inside the box. Suddenly, the mystery felt deeper. This was not just about Marcus. This was about a promise that had never been completed. Shadow walked closer and rested his head beside Ethan's hand. The Marine looked at the old K-9 and felt something he had not allowed himself to feel for a long time. Hope. Because after all these years, Shadow had not returned carrying a memory of the past. He had returned carrying a reason for the future. And somewhere beyond the snowy mountains of Montana, there was a child who had no idea that a piece of her father's story was finally coming home. The morning arrived quietly over the mountains of Montana. A thin layer of snow covered the trees, the road, and the small wooden porch outside Ethan Walker's cabin. For the first time in many years, the Marine did not begin his day by trying to forget the past. He began it by reading a letter from someone he thought he would never hear from again. Marcus Reed's words stayed in his mind long after he finished the final sentence. They were not words of goodbye. They were words of trust. Marcus had believed that some promises were too important to disappear with time. Ethan sat near the window holding the old photograph, remembering the years when life felt simpler. Back then, he and Marcus were more than teammates. They were brothers in every way that mattered. They had shared long roads, quiet conversations, and the kind of friendship that was built without needing many words. Shadow had been there through all of it. The German Shepherd was not just a working K-9. He was part of their story. He remembered the people, the places, and the moments that humans sometimes struggled to hold on to. Ethan looked down at the bracelet inside the box. He remembered Emily Carter as a little girl who would sit near Shadow and talk to him like he understood every word. Marcus always smiled when he saw them together. He used to say that Shadow had a way of making people feel safe. Now, years later, Ethan wondered what Emily's life had become. He wondered if she knew how much her father loved her. He wondered if she still remembered the old dog who once sat beside her family. Ethan searched through the information he had stored away over the years. It took several hours, but eventually he found a name and an address. Emily Carter was living in a small town several hours away. She was no longer the little girl from Marcus's stories. She had grown up. She had built a life without knowing the full story of her father's final promise. Ethan closed the laptop and looked around the cabin. For years, he had told himself that staying away was easier. He thought distance would protect everyone from old pain. But now he understood something different. Sometimes avoiding the past does not heal anything. Sometimes the past returns because something still needs to be finished. Shadow slowly stood and walked toward the door. The old K-9 looked at Ethan with the same calm confidence he had shown the night before. Ethan smiled slightly. "You already knew where this was going, didn't you?" The dog simply waited. That small moment reminded Ethan of something Marcus once said. Shadow never rushed. He never panicked. He trusted the path in front of him. Ethan packed the letter, the photograph, the bracelet, and the ammo box carefully. Every item carried a memory. Every memory carried a responsibility. Before leaving, he placed his hand on Shadow's head. "I do not know if I can fix the years we lost," Ethan whispered, "but I can finally show up." The journey ahead was not about changing the past. It was about honoring it. And as Ethan drove through the snowy roads with Shadow resting beside him, he felt something he had forgotten existed. A small feeling that maybe some broken promises were not meant to be forgotten. Maybe they were meant to find their way home. The road through Montana stretched ahead like a quiet memory waiting to be discovered. Snow covered the fields on both sides, and the mountains stood in the distance beneath a pale winter sky. Ethan Walker drove slowly, one hand resting on the steering wheel and the other occasionally reaching down to touch Shadow's old collar. The German Shepherd sat calmly beside him, watching the world pass through the window. For the first time in years, Ethan was not running away from his memories. He was traveling toward them. The small town where Emily Carter lived was several hours away, but the distance felt longer because of everything Ethan carried inside. He carried Marcus's letter. He carried the unanswered questions. He carried the weight of a promise that had waited far too long. When Ethan finally arrived, he did not immediately walk to Emily's home. He parked near a quiet street and sat for a moment. He looked at the small houses, the children walking home from school, and the ordinary life that continued while a forgotten story waited nearby. He wondered what Emily knew about her father. He wondered if she had ever heard the name Ethan Walker. Most of all, he wondered if showing up after so many years would bring comfort or confusion. Shadow lowered his head beside him. The old K-9 seemed to understand the uncertainty. Ethan smiled softly. You always make the difficult things look simple. After a few minutes, Ethan stepped out of the truck. He carried the ammo box carefully, not because it was heavy, but because of everything it represented. He walked to Emily's home and met her mother, Sarah Carter. She was surprised to see him. For a moment, there was only silence. Then Ethan introduced himself and explained why he had come. He did not make excuses. He did not try to rewrite the past. He simply told the truth. He showed her Marcus's letter. He showed her the photograph. He showed her the bracelet that Emily had given Shadow years ago. Sarah looked at the items quietly. Her expression changed as memories returned. She remembered Marcus talking about Ethan. She remembered Shadow. She remembered the promise that had never been completed. I always wondered what happened to him, she said softly. Ethan looked down. I should have come sooner. Sarah studied his face for a moment and then looked toward Shadow standing outside. The old German shepherd seemed to recognize the place. His tail moved gently. His eyes remained calm. Sarah opened the door wider. Emily should see this. Ethan waited in the living room as footsteps approached from the hallway. A young girl appeared. She was no longer the little child from Marcus's stories. She was 11 years old, with curious eyes and a quiet expression. She looked at Ethan first, then at Shadow. For a moment, everything stopped. The girl slowly stepped closer. I know that dog, Emily whispered. Ethan felt his heart tighten. She did not remember every detail. She did not know the whole story. But somehow, a connection remained. Shadow looked at her the same way he had looked at her years before, like he had never forgotten. And in that quiet room, Ethan realized something important. He had not traveled there to deliver a box. He had traveled there to return a piece of someone's heart. The room remained quiet after Emily spoke those words. I know that dog. For Ethan Walker, those 4 words carried more weight than any explanation could have. He had spent years believing that memories faded with time. He believed people moved on, places changed, and connections eventually disappeared. But standing there with Shadow beside him, Ethan realized some bonds did not vanish. They simply waited. Emily slowly walked closer to the old German shepherd. She did not rush. She looked at him carefully, as if searching through a memory that was almost out of reach. Shadow lifted his head and gently moved toward her. The moment was simple, but it felt important. The old K-9 rested beside her, just like he had done years earlier when she was a small child. Emily smiled softly. My dad used to talk about him, she said. Ethan looked at her with surprise. What did he tell you? Emily sat down near Shadow and looked at the dog's gray face. He said Shadow was the best listener in the world. He said he never forgot anyone. Ethan felt a quiet emotion rise inside him. Marcus had always believed loyalty was something you proved through actions, not words. Now, years later, Shadow was proving that once again. Sarah watched from across the room as Ethan and Emily talked. She could see something changing. This was not just about an old letter or a forgotten box. This was about a connection that had survived years of silence. Ethan placed the ammo box on the table and opened it carefully. Emily looked at the contents with curiosity. She touched the old photograph of her father and Shadow. Her expression softened. I remember this place, she said. I was little, but I remember Shadow sitting next to me. Ethan smiled. He remembered too. Emily looked at the bracelet inside the box. Her eyes became emotional. I made this for him. Ethan nodded. Your father kept it safe all these years. The room became still. Sometimes the smallest objects carried the biggest stories. A simple bracelet, an old photograph, a handwritten letter. Things that seemed ordinary to others but meant everything to the people connected to them. Emily picked up the letter from Marcus and looked at Ethan. Did my dad know you would come here? Ethan paused. He thought about the question. The truth was, he did not know. He did not know if Marcus expected this exact moment. He did not know if anyone could predict what would happen after so many years. But he knew one thing. Marcus trusted him. Your father believed people could find their way back, Ethan said quietly. Emily looked down at the letter. I wish I could have heard him say that. Ethan sat beside her, leaving enough space for her to feel comfortable. I think he would want you to know that he was proud of you. Those words meant more than Ethan expected. Emily held the letter close and looked toward Shadow. The old K-9 rested peacefully near her feet. The same dog who had carried memories through the snow was now sitting beside the person those memories belonged to. Later that evening, Ethan stood outside Sarah's home while the winter air moved gently around him. He looked back through the window and saw Emily sitting with Shadow. For years, Ethan believed he had lost the chance to honor his promise. But maybe promises were not measured by how quickly they were completed. Maybe they were measured by whether someone was willing to return and try. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan felt that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The days that followed were unlike anything Ethan Walker had expected. When he first arrived in Emily Carter's town, he thought he was only there to deliver a message and return to the quiet life he had built in Montana. He never imagined that a simple visit would begin rebuilding connections that had been broken by time. Each morning, Ethan would stop by Sarah's home with Shadow beside him. The old German shepherd moved slowly now, but his presence still filled the room with a sense of comfort. Emily would sit near him, asking questions about the stories her father never had the chance to finish telling her. Ethan answered every question honestly. He told her about Marcus's kindness. He told her about the way Marcus always cared about others before himself. He told her about the small moments that showed who Marcus truly was. Emily listened carefully, holding on to every detail. For her, these were not just stories. They were pieces of a father she wished she had known better. One afternoon, Ethan brought the old notebook from the ammo box. Inside were pages filled with Marcus's handwriting. Some pages contained simple thoughts. Others contained memories of places they had visited and people they had met. But near the end of the notebook was something that caught Ethan's attention. It was a note written directly to Emily. Ethan hesitated before handing it to her. He understood that some words belonged to family. But Sarah gently nodded, knowing Marcus had intended for Emily to have them someday. Emily opened the page slowly. Her eyes moved across the handwriting she had not seen in years. The note was short, but every word carried love. Marcus wrote about how proud he was of her. He wrote that even when life changed, she should always remember that she was never forgotten. Emily held the notebook close. No dramatic words were needed. No explanation could replace the feeling of finally receiving something that had been missing. Ethan watched quietly from across the room. He realized that this was the moment Shadow had been waiting for. Not the opening of the box. Not the discovery of the letter. This moment. The moment when a memory became real again. Later that evening, Ethan and Emily walked outside with Shadow. The town was covered in a soft layer of snow, and the streetlights created a warm glow against the cold night air. Emily looked at Ethan. Did you miss my dad? She asked. Ethan stopped for a moment. He looked toward the mountains in the distance. Every day, he answered. Emily nodded. Me too. Those simple words connected them in a way neither of them expected. Ethan realized that he and Emily shared something beyond Marcus. They both carried the same empty space. They both understood what it felt like to miss someone who mattered deeply. Shadow walked slowly between them, staying close to both sides. The old K-9 did not need to understand every word. He only needed to be there. In the following weeks, Ethan found himself becoming part of Emily's life in small ways. He helped her with projects. He listened to her dreams. He shared stories about the world beyond their small town. He was not trying to replace anyone. He was simply keeping a promise that had waited years for someone to remember it. And every evening, when Shadow rested near the fireplace, Ethan looked at the old K-9 and understood something important. The journey had never been about finding a box. It had always been about finding the people connected to it. A forgotten message had brought them together, but loyalty was what kept them from drifting apart again. Winter slowly began to fade in the small town where Ethan Walker had found a second chance. The snow was still covering the mountains, but the days were becoming brighter, and the cold air no longer felt as heavy as before. For Ethan, something inside him had changed. He still carried the memories of the past, but they no longer felt like a weight holding him down. They had become reminders of the people who shaped his life and the promises that still mattered. Emily Carter noticed the change too. When Ethan first arrived, she saw him as a stranger connected to a story she barely understood. Now, she saw him as someone who carried pieces of her father's memories and cared enough to bring them back. Their friendship grew through ordinary moments. Ethan taught her how to repair small things around the house. Emily showed him the drawings she created at school. They talked about dreams, fears, and the little things that made each day special. Shadow was always nearby, quietly watching. The old German shepherd had become part of their routine. Every morning, Emily would greet him with a smile. Every afternoon, Shadow would rest near her while she finished her homework. Ethan often looked at them and remembered the young girl who once sat beside Marcus's K-9 years ago. It felt as if time had created a circle, bringing something lost back to where it belonged. One evening, Ethan and Emily sat outside while the sun disappeared behind the mountains. The sky turned orange and gold, creating a peaceful moment that neither of them wanted to end. Emily held the old photograph of Marcus and Shadow. "Do you think my dad knew this would happen?" she asked. Ethan looked at the picture for a long time. He thought about Marcus's faith in people. He thought about the way Marcus always believed kindness could travel farther than anyone expected. "I think your dad believed people could find their way back to each other," Ethan said. Emily looked down at the photograph. "I am glad Shadow remembered." Ethan smiled softly. "So am I." Those words stayed with him. For years, Ethan believed memories were painful because they reminded him of what he lost. But Emily helped him understand something different. Memories were also proof that love had existed. They were evidence that certain connections were too important to disappear. A few days later, Ethan took Emily and Shadow to a quiet field outside town. He brought the old ammo box with him. They sat together and looked through the items one more time. But this time, the box no longer felt like a mystery. It felt like a collection of moments that had finally reached the right person. Emily carefully placed the bracelet back inside. "I think my dad would be happy," she said. Ethan nodded. "I think he would too." Shadow rested beside them, his eyes peaceful. The old K-9 had traveled through snow and years of silence to complete something meaningful. He had not carried the box because he was following an order. He carried it because loyalty was part of who he was. As the evening became quiet, Ethan realized that he was no longer living only as a former Marine haunted by the past. He was someone who had found a new purpose, someone who could still make a difference, someone who had learned that showing up, even years later, could still change a life. And beside him was the old K-9 who had proven one simple truth. Some bonds do not disappear with time. They wait patiently until the moment they are needed again. Spring slowly arrived in the small Montana town, bringing warmer days, softer sunlight, and a feeling that something new was beginning. For Ethan Walker, the change was not only outside his window. It was happening inside him. The man who once spent every day trying to stay distant from the world had started to understand the value of being present. He no longer woke up surrounded only by memories. Now, he woke up knowing someone was waiting to share the day with him. Emily Carter had become a reminder that life could continue after loss. She did not erase the past. She helped him understand it. One afternoon, Ethan found Emily sitting beside Shadow in the backyard, reading one of her school assignments aloud to him. The old German shepherd rested peacefully, his eyes half closed as if he was listening carefully. Ethan smiled from a distance. It was a simple scene, but it carried something powerful. Years earlier, Shadow had sat beside Marcus. Now he sat beside Emily. The same loyalty that connected one generation was quietly connecting another. Later that day, Emily asked Ethan a question he did not expect. "Do you ever miss being a Marine?" Ethan looked toward the mountains before answering. He thought about his years of service. He thought about the people he met, the lessons he learned, and the moments that changed him forever. "I miss the people," he said. "More than anything." Emily nodded. She understood. Missing someone was not only about sadness. Sometimes it was a way of honoring how important they were. Ethan realized that Marcus would have understood this moment. He would have understood why Shadow came back. He would have understood why a forgotten box became the beginning of a new chapter. That evening, Ethan opened the old ammo box one more time. He carefully placed the letters and photographs inside. But this time, he added something new. A picture of Emily and Shadow sitting together in the spring sunlight. A new memory. A new piece of the story. Emily watched him place the photograph inside. "Why are you putting that there?" she asked. Ethan smiled. "Because someday, someone might need to remember this moment too." Those words stayed with Emily. She realized the box was no longer only about her father. It was about everyone connected by kindness. Marcus, Ethan, Shadow, and now her. The following weeks brought small changes. Ethan began visiting more often. He helped around the house. He shared stories with Emily's family. He became someone they could depend on. Not because he was trying to repay an old promise, but because caring for people had become part of who he was again. Shadow continued to move slowly, but his spirit remained strong. He spent his days walking beside Ethan and Emily, enjoying quiet moments that did not require words. One evening, Ethan sat beside the old K-9 near the porch. The mountains were glowing under the sunset. "You know," Ethan said softly, "I thought your last mission was bringing that box to me." Shadow looked up calmly. "But I was wrong." The Marine placed his hand gently on the dog's collar. "Your real mission was bringing people back together." The old German shepherd closed his eyes peacefully. And in that quiet moment, Ethan understood something he had forgotten long ago. The greatest missions were not always the ones written in orders. Sometimes they were the ones written in the hearts of those who never stopped caring. The seasons continued to change, but the story that began with a frozen road and an old K-9 carrying a forgotten box had already changed the lives of everyone connected to it. Months had passed since Ethan Walker first opened the old ammo box beside his fireplace, yet the meaning behind that moment continued to grow. What once represented a painful memory had become a symbol of hope, connection, and a promise finally fulfilled. Ethan still lived in his small Montana cabin, but it no longer felt empty. The quiet mornings were different now. There were phone calls from Emily. There were visits to Sarah's home. There were moments shared with Shadow that reminded him he was no longer walking through life alone. The old German shepherd had grown slower with time, but his spirit remained the same. Every step he took seemed to carry the same purpose that brought him through the snow that winter night. One afternoon, Ethan and Emily returned to the field where they had looked through the contents of the ammo box together. The grass moved gently in the breeze, and the mountains stood quietly in the distance. Emily carried the old photograph of Marcus and Shadow. She looked at it carefully before placing it back into the box. "I used to think I lost my dad's memories," she said. Ethan looked at her. "You did not lose them. You just had to find the people who still carried them." Emily smiled. Those words meant something to both of them. Ethan had spent years believing he failed Marcus because he was not there sooner. But now he understood that loyalty was not about being perfect. It was about choosing to show up when the opportunity finally came. Shadow walked slowly around them before settling down near Ethan's feet. The Marine looked at the old K-9 and remembered the night everything changed. A freezing storm. A mysterious box. A dog who refused to give up. At the time, Ethan thought Shadow had brought him a secret from the past. But the truth was much greater. Shadow had brought him a future. A future where a young girl could know her father's love. A future where a former Marine could forgive himself. A future where an old K-9 could finish the mission he carried in his heart. Years later, people in the small town would remember the story of the dog who crossed the snow carrying a box. Some would talk about the mystery. Some would talk about the unlikely journey. But Ethan always remembered something different. He remembered the loyalty behind every step Shadow took. He remembered the trust of a friend who believed promises mattered. He remembered the moment when a simple act of devotion brought two lives back together. On a peaceful evening, Ethan sat beside Shadow under the Montana sky. The old German shepherd rested comfortably, surrounded by the people he helped reconnect. Ethan placed a hand on the dog's collar and whispered, "You were never just bringing something back. You were bringing someone home." The wind moved softly through the trees. The sunset painted the mountains with warm light. And for a moment, everything felt complete. Because some stories do not end with a victory. Some stories end with forgiveness. Some stories end with healing. And some stories are completed by a loyal soul who never forgot the way home.